Welcome back, and on today's episode we're going to be talking about coilovers. This is where the intro goes. I'm just going to sit and wait. Look, I can do this. I fixed it. So, coilovers. I don't know why I'm doing that again. So this is one of the things that I get asked about the most at work. So I wanted to do, I've been meaning to do a video for ages. So we're going to be talking about coilovers and why you need them and what they do. And thanks to my friends over at Tein. I think that's right. Do you want to learn about coilovers? Okay. So, what are coilovers? Well, coilovers are simply a coil over a shock absorber or damper. Hence, coilover. You'll see these in lots of applications, the most common of which is a McPherson strut style, where it's both the upper arm and the shock absorber, so it's got to be really strong. Things such as like an MX5, you will have an inboard shock absorber where it's attached to the lower arm and to the body, so it's not effectively doing any of the camber adjustment. That's all through the lower arms. We'll talk about that at another point. Don't buy cheap coilovers. Don't buy cheap coilovers. So, why do I need coilovers? Why do you need coilovers on your car? So if you are tracking the car, or you're doing a fast road car, or you've got a road car where the shocks are knackered, then you need coilovers. It allows you to change the height of the car, the damping on the car, the caster, the camber, the spring rate, the damping. You can change everything. Why wouldn't you do it? They are lighter than shocks and springs. So why would you want coilovers over normal springs and shocks? A lot of people would say that coilovers are uncomfortable or they're bad for the road. I don't agree with it. I think it's a lot of the time is people getting the wrong spring rates on cars, which causes them to just be awful. People not setting up cars properly, not having proper alignments or dampening set up properly is a lot of the problems. Stock shock absorbers are not optimized to work with the different dynamics introduced with lowering springs, and it leads to suboptimal performance and increased wear over time on the damper. It can cause premature failure of the damper, and the shock stroke is no longer correct for the new coil spring. If you want lowering springs and you want to do dampers and lowering springs, then use an uprated damper, something like an Enduro Pro that Tein do. They're going to be more optimized to using lowering springs. How to adjust coilovers? Super simple. Most set of coilovers you will have twin perch, which means that the bottom collar is adjusting the ride height of the shock, and the two top locked rings will be adjusting the preload. You do not touch those. When they come out of the factory, the preload is generally set, but you can check it by unlocking them, measuring the preload and the spring, and locking them back together. But 9 times out of 10, you're not going to be changing the preload. You're just going to be unlocking the bottom collar, using the top two to turn it, and that adjusts the ride height. It can take a while to set up coilovers. They can be quite fiddly and finessey, especially when you've got to remember things like if you change the front left tyre height, it's going to affect the rear right like this. So you have to remember things like that if you're going to be setting up coilovers yourself. I've clipped some bits out of Tein's video to show you. So there's two types of dampings. There's two types of there's two damping styles with shock absorbers. You have a twin tube damper and a monotube damper. Now, they are different depending on what specification you're using the shock absorber for. So a twin tube is what it says. There's two tubes inside a casting, one inside the other. There's oil in the inner tube and gas in the outer tube. A base valve at the bottom. The piston and the valve pushes down in the cylinder and it takes up volume. The remaining fluid has to go somewhere, so it's forced up into the outer tube. That's how they work. But twin tubes are primarily used in OEM applications or for comfort and road use, really. There's less stress on the seals inside the shock absorber. It's very much like an OEM damper. So they're primarily used in road cars, fast road cars, and if you want to do the occasional track day. They're more prone to aeration, which is when the shock is going up and down inside. It starts frothing up, so continued use, if you were hot lapping it out on the track, you're going to get more aeration than you would as a mono tube shock. And the outer shell of the shock absorber can trap a lot of the heat. Monotubes are most common as what you'll find in a lot of coilover applications. So it's a single tube and a piston, and So it's a single tube with a piston, and inside the tube is gas and oil. There's one large piston. They are more designed for track application or fast road because they have a stiffer ride, but it's more precise. They are less prone to aeration because of the design of big single tube and big single piston, and they are better at dissipating heat. Damping. How does damping work? So damping is adjusted with your twiddly knob on the top, which adjusts the damping. Loads of people don't know what it actually does or how it works. So basically what happens is when you twiddle that knob, that's what she said, you're opening and closing orifices inside the valve, letting more or less oil pass through. This means that the flow of oil inside the shock can bypass the shock piston and shim stack quicker or slower, depending on how you have it. The quicker the oil can pass through, the softer the damping, because there's less resistance on it, and the slower it can pass through, the harder the damping effect is, because it's harder to push through that oil. On single damping, which is what you get on most cars, so on Tein it's 16 way, it's usually 32 way on things like BC. The compression and rebound are adjusted in the same setting, unless you have an external reservoir, which we're not going to go into today. What is compression and rebound? So simply, compression is how the spring's compressed. Compression is how your suspension deals with bumps. Rebound is how quickly the shock returns to its original state. So compression, rebound. So what are the differences between droop and bump? So droop is the amount the wheel can drop down. So if you're on a flat road and there's small dip happens, droop is what lets the wheel drop down and keep it in contact with the road. Whereas bump is, if you hit a bump, it's how the wheel moves back up into the body. So it's a bit like when we have compression and rebound. So droop is when it drops down and bump is when it comes back up. That was easy. Preload. So what is preload? Preload is just how much load is on that spring, how much that spring is compressed. Generally, you're not going to be changing the preload on a car at all. Changing the preload does not affect the spring rate. On some cars, you do not have a twin perch style, so you've only got a single adjustment, which will adjust the preload in turn as changing the ride height. Changing the preload will just affect the droop. Spring rates. So what are spring rates? So spring rates simply are how stiff a spring is. If you've got a 5 kilogram spring, it means that it takes 5 kilograms of pressure to compress that spring 1 mil. So it's literally a measurement of weight and how much it takes to compress at a certain length. That's how we do it in the UK. I know it's different in other countries, but yeah, a 5 kilogram spring, it just means it takes 5 kilograms to compress it 1mm. The higher the number, obviously the stiffer the spring. So on a road car, you generally want to go for a softer spring. If you've got something like a rear-wheel drive car, you'll go for a stiffer spring at the back to try if you want more oversteer bias. And you can tune the car that way by changing spring weights. Again, this is going to be another video. So there's 3 styles of damping that you get. Generally when you're looking at buying coilovers, you'll see like a graph like this. I'll put it here. So you've got digressive, linear and progressive. So the main 2 you'll see is going to be digressive and linear. We're not going to go into how they all work at the moment. That is a whole video on its own. Basically, digressive means that they are good at handling big bumps. So if you're on the racetrack and you're hitting the curbs all the time, digressive shocks are really good at dealing with big bumps. But they're not so good at dealing with small undulations in the road, so like normal driving conditions. Linear damping, it's kind of what it says. Linear damping is good at everything. So they're the ones that are generally straight through the middle on the graph. Things like BCBRs and FlexZs are linear damping styles. So they're good for someone that's using the car on the road, like a fast road car, normal road car, or an occasional track car. The BCBRs that I have on the Celica are a linear damping style, as are the FlexZs that I've got on the MR2.
Nice.
And they work so well, like on track. They do everything. I love linear damping. Don't buy cheap coilovers. Camber plates. So real quickly, real simple explanation. So on top of a McPherson strut style coilover, you're going to have a camber plate. I'll show you a picture now. So that plate allows you to adjust how far in or out that coilover sits in relation to the body. So the further in it sits, the more negative camber you've got. The further out it sits, the more positive camber. You don't want that. You want negative camber or neutral camber. We will talk about caster camber in a later video when we talk about alignments and probably things like bushes and things like that. So I'm not going to go into it. They are your basics. So that's what you need to know. Caster is basically how far the wheel sits back in the arch, forward and back. So I'm doing this wrong. Imagine that's your wheel. That's the body, maybe. So camber is like that, and caster is how far forward and back the wheel sits. Maybe. So, I don't know. We'll talk about it later. Don't buy cheap coilovers. What coilovers do I need to buy? So this is one of the most common questions I get asked about every day. So it really depends on what you're doing with the car. If you have got a fast road car and you're just looking for something for the road, then you want something probably that's like a linear damping style, maybe on a twin tube or damper. If you are going to be tracking the car, you're going to want a more digressive damping, and you're going to want a monotube design damping. Again, the more you spend, the better quality they are. Do not buy cheap coilovers. Hopefully, this has given you a basic understanding of what different bits are on a coilover, why you need coilovers, and what they do. As I say, we are going to be doing another video later on where we're explaining all this in depth. I'll take each thing, we'll break it down, and we'll talk about it, and we'll explain it properly. But for today, this is just a basic of how they work and why you need them. So hopefully you've learned something. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to give us a like and a subscribe. There's more videos here. If you want to learn about brake pads or anti-roll bars, there's videos down here. And if you want to see me fit coilovers to the MR2, click here. Thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you next week.